Hello, in this video I'm going to be proving that Atlantis exists via another method. And this is by showing that the survival of Egypt is a common theme in both Plato's dialogues and the book of Genesis. Now we know that Egypt in the book of Genesis is prominently featured as a civilization in which the first time it is mentioned is when Abraham, during a famine in his native land, goes to Egypt with his wife in order to secure food and to basically survive. And that's the first time Egypt is really mentioned as a culture, apparently, and as a civilization. And Egypt in Plato's dialogues is mentioned very importantly as well, is when Solon travels to Egypt and speaks to an Egyptian priest who tells him the story of Atlantis, if we are to believe Plato's account. And we are told that in that book, the reason why the Egyptians have managed to preserve the story of Atlantis to the time in which Solon arrives in Egypt is because whereas the rest of the world, including Greece and including other parts of the world, are beset by these natural disasters of various types that happen every once in a while, because of Egypt's favorable geography and the presence of the Nile River, for example, and other peculiarities of Egypt's geography, Egypt has been repeatedly spared from these natural disasters, and hence they've been able to have their civilization not be set back by these natural disasters, but on the contrary, continue to develop in such a way that allows them to have historical records that date back to the earliest time. And so that seems to be very different from Egypt in the book of Genesis at first, right? Because according to the traditional interpretation of the book of Genesis, everybody was literally wiped out from the flood except for Noah and his family. And so that seems to be a little bit contradictory. In Plato's dialogues, it seems like Egypt is this survivor. In the book of Genesis, it seems like Egypt is the victim as well as everybody else in that flood. But as we will see, this apparent contradiction between these two narratives may not in fact be a contradiction at all, but a misreading of the book of Genesis and its actual meaning. And again, this is the actual quote of the Egyptian priest and the conversation he had supposedly with Solon. And the underlined portion is the most important, for which the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. Of course, and he provides reasons as to various calamities and the fact that they are delivered and preserved from those calamities. And whereas other peoples suffer from those destructions that the Egyptians survive. And so in the book of Genesis, let's look at the question, could it possibly be that Egypt has been portrayed as a survivor of the supposedly universal flood, but that we just haven't been able to understand that because we've been assuming something about the narrative? The first thing that seems kind of contradictory is, if you look at the time between Noah's flood and Abraham actually going to Egypt, and you trace the number of years through the number of generations in which each generation begat a son and progressively add those numbers up, you get around 400 years after the flood when Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt in order to escape the famine that has taken place in their native land. But you'll notice at that time that they were speaking with a pharaoh. They were speaking with a pharaoh and his wife. And what is a pharaoh? A pharaoh is implying that a stable system of kingship and a stable political system in which there is a strong social hierarchy has already developed. And can that system really develop from scratch if Egypt had been completely wiped out by a flood? You could presume that there has been this you could presume that everything has been destroyed. The animals that Noah preserved, that would have been a good starting point for repopulating and resettling the Nile Valley. But at the same time, 400 years is a very, very short time for this complex system of agriculture that can create enough of a surplus to feed other people in the area, in addition with a stable political system with a pharaoh on top to actually have developed. That's the first thing that caught my mind. But the second thing that caught my mind, the second thing that made me wonder, no, this can't be right. Egypt was among the survivors. Egypt was completely wiped out from the flood and was resettled by the descendants of Noah, and that's because Ham's son is actually named Egypt. And from that, it seems obvious that we could imply that the sons of Egypt are the people who actually settled Egypt and then gave that civilization its name. So Ham, Egypt being the son of Ham and Ham being the son of Noah, we can kind of conclude that it was the descendants of Noah that settled Egypt when it had been completely wiped out by the flood. And that seemed to settle the debate once and for all. But at the same time, I noticed that Egypt's sons were these obscure tribes, for example, except for the Philistines, the Ludites, the Anamites, the Lehabites. Who are these people, and why do they even matter? They might be important in the sense of the Philistines, but what's important is that they are not Egyptians, because the Egyptians later in the Genesis narrative, they are actually mentioned by name. When Abraham goes to Egypt, they are called the Egyptians. These Ludites and Anamites and Lehabites, these people disappear from the map. In fact, these people seem, and so there's this contradiction. And the way that I thought about this was, what if Ham didn't name his son Egypt, and the Egyptian people ultimately became named after this founding father? But what if Egypt was actually already in existence by the time that Ham had his son, and that he saw this kingdom that was already in existence and named his son after that kingdom? This is something that's done all the time, right? This is something that we do today. Like, for example, Asia is a name that some people, some women are given in different societies across the world. Asia Asia isn't the name, isn't something that a given name it's a name that's given to someone of a place that already exists. It's not that that name gives rise to a people who become named after that name. And that's an important distinction. And it shows that I'm not saying that my interpretation in which Egypt was already in existence and that Ham named his son after that kingdom is necessarily true. I'm saying that's one possible interpretation, and that the fact that these Ludites and Anamites and Lehabites and all these people, they're not explicitly identified as Egyptian in the future. And so that's kind of something that makes me think, what if Ham's son being named Egypt, what if that was just a separate tribe of people that was completely independent of Egypt itself? And that's my interpretation of Ham having that son. And so in that interpretation in which Egypt is actually a survivor of the flood, and the fact that they are this stable civilization in which they are able to feed other people and rescue them from famines and so on, and have this complex culture already only 400 years after a flood in which supposedly everything was destroyed, we think that it takes a lot longer than that for that to happen. We think it takes it's realistic to suppose that when Noah and when Abraham was wandering the earth, when Abraham's immediate ascendants and family were wandering the earth just trying to make a living, already 400 years after the flood, and to suppose that in Egypt this fully fledged civilization had already come into existence, in my opinion, makes it unlikely that Egypt was part of Noah's lineage, that Egypt somehow had also been completely wiped out by the flood. It seems to me that the only reasonable conclusion to make is that the Egyptians had been the survivors of the flood. And this isn't explicitly stated, but it must be inferred from the evidence that we have. And the fact that it's also more likely, for example, right? It's also more likely that in in which other of Ham's sons, for example, which there's so many people who are named in this, so many names that are given and specified in the book of Genesis. There's Ham, there's Shem, there's Japheth. Which of those peoples had children who ultimately ended up being named, becoming, with those names being identified with the civilizations that were created by their descendants? Not that many, right? We don't see that many. And in that interpretation, it just makes sense that Egypt had already been in existence by the time Ham had his son. And so, what does this imply? This implies that there are two cultures, the Greeks and the Hebrews, who separately supposedly invented these two flood stories, supposing that these are fictional, which many scholars claim, in which a significant part of the world had been destroyed, but which left Egypt unscathed in both. With that being explicitly stated in the Plato's dialogues, and that being inferred with a strong sense of to a strong degree, with a strong degree of reliability in the book of Genesis. If these stories were fictional, they could have picked any culture as a survivor if they wanted to add a certain plot twist, or none at all, right? They didn't have to pick Egypt as a survivor. The fact that these supposedly fictional stories happen to both pick Egypt as the sole survivor is either a remarkable coincidence, or it's more likely it's proof that the stories are both factual accounts of a devastating flood in which the Egyptians really were the survivors. And I believe that this argument ultimately establishes the truth and the factuality, the veracity of the Atlantis story and of the book of Genesis at the same time. And that this little detail and this little element of Egypt as the sole survivor is that key fact that establishes the likely truth of both of those stories.